kick off by asking the other panelists to introduce themselves before we launch into the discussion. Please do, throughout the course of this session, if you've got any questions, post them in so that I can put them to the panel to stimulate the discussion. We'll be going for the next 45 to 50 minutes. So I'm going to start off by asking Matthew Parkins, the Technical Director at Advanced, to introduce himself to everybody in this session.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Matthew Parkins, Technical Director at Advanced Managed Services Division. Two main responsibilities: I run pre-sales and I also run product. Roughly 15 years in managed services, both in architecture and in building cloud businesses.
Thank you very much. And if I could move on to Yanis.
Thanks, Chucker. Yeah, so I'm Yanis. I am the founder of Birmingham Tech, an organisation, not-for-profit organisation designed to stimulate growth across digital technology and innovation throughout the West Midlands. As part of that, we run Birmingham Tech Week, which brings together 5,000 people across the UK to talk about kind of different challenges that we face as an industry and how we can kind of better achieve our goals over the coming years. Prior to that, held a number of private roles in organisations spanning 15 years, and yeah, big advocate for all things tech. So looking forward to this session today.
Thank you very much. And moving on to John.
Thanks. Yeah, so my name is John Regan. I'm in charge of pre-sales for the legacy modernisation business at Advanced. So really that involves pairing our solutions with our customers and making sure that we can deliver a good solution for the customers. Before that, I was in charge of delivery of the projects, spent a number of years in charge of that. So I'm very focused on making sure that when we have customer engagements, I set them up to be successful, both internally and with the customer themselves. So I've been working in legacy modernisation for around 15 years, and then 15 years before that in IT as a lead developer and technical lead. So about 30 years in IT altogether. I've worked at many, many different places.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that introduction from our panelists. And I'll perhaps just say something to frame the discussion that we are going to be having within this hour, and also just say a bit about what we at Advanced are doing in the current context. As you may know, my background is not one of being a technologist, but I worked in public policy, looking at the role of business, how we build the right infrastructure for us to go about, corporates go about making profit and servicing the needs of customers and users. And before that, I was a corporate employment lawyer for just under half a decade. And I don't think it really matters what your background is or your specialism for you to see that our lives have been changed by this pandemic, not just because of the health risks and consequences, but just the way that we are living. At the beginning of this era that we've been living through, I remember the CEO of Microsoft commenting at the height of the infections and death rate in March, April time, that we had seen in March and April an acceleration of digitization in 2 months that one would expect to see in 2 years. Fundamentally, what we're going through has changed the way that we live, the way that we work, the way that we exist. Once kind of reflected on as I came to start living my life on Zoom and Teams, is how even just a few months beforehand, to be frank, I was fairly unaware of what Zoom was. I remember the leader of the political party of which I was a part, and in the midst of a general election campaign, suggesting that we get together and not have a conference call of different players organising a big national campaign, but that we join this app called Zoom. I'd never heard of it before, and yet here we are, just over half a year later, doing this webinar on that platform. And so it's fundamentally changed everything and has given everybody a lot to think about, not least businesses, in terms of how you go about continuing to get revenue, make profit, and employ your people in spite of changing patterns. At Advanced, we've got a diverse, a pretty sophisticated portfolio of work that we do for clients both in the public and the private sector. Just to give you a sense of the scale of what we're doing, our clinical patient management system, Adastra, was already handling 80% of NHS 111 calls in England. In the 10 days after everybody had to kick into action to respond to the pandemic, we extended this service to cope with tens of thousands of extra inquiries a day and to allow 3,000 clinicians to use the system at any one time. So we've very much been at the coalface of the change and transformation that has been needed by organisations in the public and the private sector to deal with what we're going through. We have been providing support desk support through our managed services operations for the NHS 119 service for GPs to give them the support they need as they get set up to use video conferencing for virtual appointments, which I'm sure many people who are taking part in this webinar have been experiencing for the first time, having usually been used to just going in to the local surgery down the road. And more recently, we reached a major milestone in a project that we've been doing for the DWP, where we've been migrating 9 of their core legacy systems into something more appropriate, and has meant that job seekers allowance application now runs over 50% faster than it was. So that's just to give a sense of how things have been impacting on us and how we've been helping our customers through these tumultuous times that we're living in. So that's just to provide a bit of context. And to start with, if I come to you, Matthew, I mean, I've obviously been given just a very kind of big picture macro overview of what we've been doing, but could you just share some insight into some of the work that has taken place at the organisations that we've been working with beyond what I've just set out?
Sure. And you mentioned that it's accelerated maybe by 2 years. I think in some areas it's far larger a leapfrog. The work from home aspect is very clear and a well-trodden path. But I think overall, organizations that have done well in very challenging times, I heard a great quote the other day that sometimes doing well is just standing still, right? Flat is the new growth. I think I heard the other day as well. But the organizations that have done well have in a very short period of time not only developed that digital strategy, but also executed them at pace. And those that have managed to execute at pace, depending on vertical, depending on industry, have either leapfrogged less nimble competitors or have really struggled just to deliver the fundamental services that their customers expect. I think for me, the biggest focus has been on the acceleration of what I would call a virtual or an immersive experience. So a few months ago, the idea of a GP or an occupational therapist diagnosing a patient over a video call rather than seeing them face to face, the idea of a virtual gathering, the idea of the kind of retail experiences that we see coming out, and it, you know, even buying a house, the idea of being shown around a house on Zoom, for example, would really be unthinkable. But what's happened is not only have those things been contemplated, put in place and executed, but actually for some have worked incredibly well. And my hope in a lot of these areas are that as we exit, hopefully in a timely manner and very safely, this pandemic era, that we take the best bits of that experience. So for example, you know, that a GP could see people over a video conference and then move to face-to-face if necessary, as a sensible and pragmatic way to take the best of what we've had to deal with in the last few months, and maybe sacrifice some of that inconvenience for security and compliance perspectives. And I think that kind of leads me on to the next point, which is, in terms of what has changed, innovation has happened at pace. And so now I think we're seeing that second wave around security and compliance. Many organizations have had to get those functions running, sometimes with tens of users, sometimes with hundreds of users, sometimes with thousands of users. And when we work at pace and we work at scale, I think organizations have had to make some really sensible sacrifices and strike a balance between innovation and continuing the business process. And what we're seeing now is really that shoring up. So we know that cybersecurity incidents are up. We know that organizations' attack vectors are far more wide, and that as a result, things like phishing, for example, has been more prevalent. And I think certainly what I'm seeing now are a lot of organizations that have implemented those are now looking back and saying, okay, so we deployed working from home, we deployed exposing some of our internal systems, we employed maybe a new way of buying, new logistics systems. Okay, how do we secure those? How do we make sure they're compliant? But without throttling them too much, which are probably some of the roadblocks that prevented that adoption in the first place.
Thanks very much. And just in terms of do you have any sense on the data side of the sheer scale of cyber attacks, phishing attacks, that kind of behavior? To what extent has it ballooned?
I think there are better people than I in terms of whether it's a 2x or 4x increase. But what we do know is that organizations have taken on new systems, software or infrastructure, adopting new platforms and adopting new tools, which means that a user now has far more applications accessible to them in different areas. So that network of applications and that network of integration is far wider than it has been historically. The natural result of that is a much larger footprint for attack.
Understood. John, I mentioned legacy applications, and obviously they've been hitting the news in recent times, and you've had, in some desperation, I suppose, if you look at the governor of New Jersey in the US putting out a call for COBOL volunteers, people understand these things. Could you give a little bit more context about why this legacy application issue has been such a hot topic, and do you see a read across? I mentioned the US there and the challenges there to what we're experiencing here in the UK.
Yeah, thanks, Chucker. First of all, I'd just like to welcome you all to my world, because I've been working from home for about 10 years. So I already know all about Zoom and Skype and all these things. It's been quite entertaining.
It made me feel like a Neanderthal, the fact, now Zoom is so ubiquitous. I was like, how the hell did I not know about this thing beforehand? But actually, I'll tell you one thing, sorry, I'm slightly cutting you here. It's a very good illustration that if you don't change and adapt, and going to the point that Matthew was making about innovation, you'll get left behind, because obviously Microsoft have Teams now, but this should have been Skype's time. Skype was what I, as just Joe Blogs consumer, knew about. Where has Skype been in this pandemic?
Yeah, well, been found wanting, I think, a little bit, Chucker, compared to the other options. Generous,
but there you go.
Yeah. It's funny, actually, because a lot of the application modernisation team at Advance have been working from home for quite a long time, actually. So one of our customers asked us what our COVID pandemic, strategy was, and we said, well, we just stay in our houses like we normally do. That's what we do now. So anyway, back to your question. New Jersey did find itself in a bit of a difficult position, really. They're reliant on unemployment benefit system that was creaking at the seams due to the lack of skilled resources to maintain it, and the sheer increase in volume in claimants that came along with the COVID outbreak. And I think that problem's been manifest itself across, lots of places in the US and in the UK and Europe. I mean, here in the UK, I think many companies have been grappling with similar challenges. And it's really come into focus. The whole technical debt, and lack of skills in legacy applications has become a big issue for customers. It's funny because what used to happen is it used to be about the money. So people used to want to do legacy modernisation, modernise their old assets because the old platforms cost a lot of money. They had a high total cost of ownership. They were difficult to maintain. Now, all of a sudden, there's a whole new facet to that where there's no developers, and typically what that tells me is that those applications have been doing really well for the companies that have been using them. They haven't had to change them. They just do what they need to do. They're running their business. It's all fantastic. But of course, when something out of the ordinary happens and they need to make changes in a hurry, they just don't have the bandwidth or the manpower to do it. The other day I was talking to a large bank in Europe, and for their particular largest application they do that handles all their loans and everything, they've got 10 developers. So it's not too bad. But unfortunately, in 3 years' time, 5 of them will have retired. So they're starting to get a bit nervous, let's say, about how that's going to work because, obviously changes come up. They need to do things. Their application is very bespoke, does everything they need it to, So, people more and more people are turning to us and companies like us to see what we can do to help them modernise their applications. Here in the UK, as you mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work with the Department of Work and Pensions, rehosting their main applications. So apart from universal credit, basically. So job seekers allowance, employment support, pensions, all the other things, all the other benefits. And over half the applications have gone live, as you said now. And the job seekers allowance went live at Easter. And that was well timed, really, just as the number of claimants probably went through the roof. So there were some limits in the old world, actually. So that was probably very, very timely because maybe some changes would have been needed to make to the old system before it moved. As you'd expect, modernisation of large critical systems like that is pretty complex. Lots of challenges, but it's been really good. Actually, we've worked in partnership well with DWP and some of their other partners to deliver success. So support for legacy applications is now a hot topic, really, for most organisations, and they're actively investigating what they can do, which has really shown an increase in people coming to talk to us, actually. No one else really wants to be the guy on TV saying, "Oh, I can't really pay everybody, or I can't really do anything because we can't maintain our applications properly." That's not a good place to be.
Of course, I think one of the interesting things was obviously on the government side with the DWP. This was perhaps the first test of whether or not the government verify scheme could identify and onboard people to use those systems to pay universal credit. And I think one of the general observations that I kind of make of what's going on is that even in the old world, sometimes it was a challenge for these expectations to be met. I think with Verify, the idea was that people, up to 26 million people would be using that to onboard to use government services. But just when you're dealing with the scale and the speed with what we've been finding in a pandemic, I just think it's maybe we were asking the technology to do impossible things. What is your sense of? Do you think that this is going to make people think about how they plan for the future when they're looking at their systems?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was very easy to do nothing about legacy modernisation. The things work well for 30 years, just leave it alone. It'll work for another 20. And that's sort of okay as long as nothing else changes. But when other things change, all of a sudden you've got a problem. And I think that's really what organisations are waking up to. It's different for different. I think it's different for different organisations and different companies because some people who live in a very volatile world have already have that issue, But a lot of things that are normally very stable, very very the same all the time. Banks, insurance companies, the government, for example. Things don't happen that quickly or that rapidly normally. So they're the ones who've been most challenged, I think.
And I suppose it's particularly the big organisations because to get change through the sheer scale of some of these organisations, I think is very difficult, particularly in the public sector. Yanis, obviously you're operating across public and private, with a great focus on the digital skills gap, which I think has been thrown into sharp relief by what we've been going through. And if businesses and, with the workforce having a set of skills before the pandemic weren't adapting and changing to the increasing digital nature of our lives, well, they're certainly going to have to do so now. And those who don't do so quick enough are probably going to die, organizations and companies, that is. What do you think is key to closing this skills gap? Obviously, if people are going to be operating either updated legacy systems or new systems altogether, that's going to potentially require quite a lot of retraining in some cases. What do you think are the key things that the government needs to be thinking about this? And obviously, we've got the budget coming up in the next couple of months, and they'll be making decisions as to where to deploy finance. What's your take?
Yeah, first of all, fascinating hearing from Matthew and John there. I think that we've been talking about digital transformation for a long time, but that's part of the problem. We've been talking about it, but we haven't really been executing on it. And I saw a kind of a tongue-in-cheek post the other day, which was, "What's the biggest driver of digital transformation in your company? Is it the CEO? Is it the CTO? Is it the CIO? Or is it COVID?" And I think we all know the answer to that, right? It's been the catalyst for kind of rapid change across organizations, whether that's modernizing legacy systems or looking at new technology, and primarily new technology that enables collaboration across business. I think a lot of the systems were in place to do admin functions and help engage consumers were fit for purpose, but actually treating a kind of disparate workforce who are kind of remote, some are in the office, requires change. And of course, that then requires more people with the right digital skills to enable that technology and deliver value to both consumers and stakeholders as well. And really, it's paramount to, the success of the UK. I think a report by Accenture last year said that actually it would cost the UK 140 billion pounds in GDP growth if we didn't address the digital skills gap. So it's kind of loud and clear, it should be front of mind. Now, I guess you look at two sides of the spectrum of digital skills. The first side...
Sorry, Yanis, can I just ask a question? I'm sorry to cut you. When we're looking at how we upskill and people and help them adapt to, what we're talking about is the fourth industrial revolution, essentially here. What is the approach you would take? Because obviously you're on the combined authority over there in the West Midlands. And do you think this is something, and I remember when I was Shadow Secretary of State for Business and we were developing policy, there was always this tension between the extent to which you do this as a regional thing and you devolve powers and let the regions decide and players, businesses, policymakers, the different educational institutions determine what is needed for that place, and to what extent do you actually reside the kind of power to get things done within particular sectors? Where I suppose everyone here will probably expect you to say, yeah, it's all about the geography, give us the power, but where do you draw the line between the kind of sectoral and the kind of devolved geographical dimension to addressing these skills issues?
Yeah, I think it's a number of things. Absolutely, you would expect me to say, give the combined authority kind of more power to make decisions and fund the right, training schemes. And we've done that. Andy Street kind of powered the Beat the Bot scheme, which was £1 million fund, which ran a number of successful training schemes across the region to help retrain individuals. We had School of Code, which was helping kind of retrain people from non-digital sectors into digital roles, and the Black Coder Academy, which was specifically designed for Black women to get into tech roles, and also Code Your Future, which was looking at kind of people who are either kind of refugees or from a disadvantaged background to get into tech. So it's looking at these kind of specific areas, but I think this needs to be UK wide as well. The government, should invest more in kind of enabling these training funds training schemes to actually kind of deliver the digital skills to the people that need it most. And I know for a fact the training schemes we've got here in the West Midlands are oversubscribed, and we can't keep up with demand of people wanting these skills. Now, that gap is being plugged by the private sector as well. So we've got people like BT, Microsoft, Cisco, who also sit on the kind of DSP board here, who are providing, digital skills training. Microsoft have their digital skills week this week. So there are some good. So I think it's a combination of public and private sector coming together. But also it's kind of making sure young people have got the right digital skills as well. And I've got to be careful here because my wife's a teacher. But I think that education across the board needs to kind of deliver more so that young people have the digital skills. We kind of tend to say they're more digital savvy than they ever have been, but should we be using social media and mobile phones as a barometer of success? Probably not. I think they need to have the right digital skills to actually, run these systems and deliver value for organisations.
What about, I'm going to come to Matthew next, but what about the argument that says, yes, that's right with young people, but they've grown up with these technologies. It's much more a feature of their lives. They understand it. Whereas going into the autumn, it looks like we are going through a recovery. The speed of it will vary. But increasingly, it looks like it will be a jobless recovery, particularly if the furlough scheme isn't extended beyond its expiry. And we're quite likely to get a lot of people in their 50s and their 60s who are being made redundant with a set of skills that are no longer relevant to the modern age, but they're being made redundant at a time when it's too early for them to retire. How do you think... And I mean, the stereotype says, oh, because they're older, they won't necessarily know how to use all this technology as well, which is, as we all know, is a load of rubbish. But what do we do about that cohort? Because it seems to me that, I mean, young people always get hammered in a downturn, but in a way, they're not, that, retirement's a long way off. There's time to adapt, adjust, etc. But what about that, late to middle age person who suddenly, they've been doing the same job for 15 to 20 years. They didn't use all this technology that we're talking about on this call. And suddenly they're kind of jobless, retirement's far off, and they don't have any skills. Maybe they may not have been sitting on Teams and Zoom calls like some of us on this webinar for the last few months, but have been furloughed, and suddenly what are they going to do? And how are you thinking about that in the West Midlands?
Yeah, I think there's a two-pronged attack to that. The first one is making sure you've got the schemes, like I mentioned, to help people retrain. I think that's integral, really. However, those schemes are only really going to give a base level of knowledge and skills to those particular individuals. So that's where I think kind of we need to bridge the gap between the public sector funding and delivering certain programs to enable people to reskill and have the right skills, but also then the organizations themselves investing in training to make sure that they're relevant for those organizations. I was only speaking to someone the other day where they had, acquired some new skills, kind of Java, CSS, HTML, gone into an organization, and they were using completely different toolkits. Now, that's fine because that base level knowledge enabled them to, quickly understand it. But that organization had invested in training schemes to make sure that individual could get to the level required to deliver value. And so I think it's on two sides. Organizations need to invest more in training schemes, and the public sector needs to kind of carry on doing what they're doing. They're doing a good job, but not a great job. And I think that's where we need more investment.
Okay, let me come to Matthew. Matthew, just based on the experiences of our customers at Advanced, what would you take as the 3 or 4 biggest lessons learned from the last 9 months?
Biggest 3 or 4, I would say business cases being absolutely rock solid. So I've seen a lot of customers kind of push right. All of the things that they wanted to achieve this financial year, maybe even next financial year. And it's really litmus tested the business cases. The ones that have, the projects that are still on the table and the areas that are still moving forward are the ones where the return on investment was really rock solid. Secondly, it would be about successfully innovating at pace, being able to drive through change quickly, but in an organized way. And those that have done it well, I think, have succeeded and adapted well. But just touching on that skills gap, I think hiring, training, and retaining the right talent in an era where, especially from IT, we're all pulling from the same pools. Not only my competitors, but also the vendors, the large enterprises, the large SIs. We're all dipping into the same pool. Historically, that might have been around a bit buzzwordy around the likes of big data. Nowadays, data, AI, DevOps, hyperscale cloud. It's an incredibly small talent pool of people that we're all looking for that have demonstrable skills and experience. And if I can say, I use the term scar tissue, but what that means is, real life experience. And the biggest learning point that I've got there, and the biggest lesson, the biggest success story, are organizations you walk into that have a really good idea of when they're going to bring that skilled, experienced leader in to step change their maturity, but those that understand that they do need to invest in those entry level roles, that have the good graduate schemes. I'm a big advocate of the likes of AWS Restart, for example, that takes people from other walks of life, sometimes even ex-service people, gives them the transferable skills that they need. And so essentially you're hiring the right kind of DNA, and you're taking that dual view that you're going to bring in your immediate skills and experience to step change you, but you're going to supplement that longer term. Not only is that going to help, frankly, with your cost base, because salaries in these areas are going up, but also, frankly, frankly, in the past, if you were going to build a team, if you were going to build a center of excellence, you could probably man that team with men and women from the outside. These days, I think, unless you have an idea of how you're going to supplement internally and push up from the bottom, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to fill the positions that you have. My very last point. Oh no, go on, sorry, Chuka.
Did you say there's a last one?
Yeah, my very last point, if I could quickly squeeze it in, complementing that point is around company culture. You have to be an organization that not only can hire and train, that can attract talent, but most importantly, you have to be able to retain. You have to have a clear sense of your mission, your vision, and a clear understanding of your values in order for those people to resonate and stay with you for years, not months.
Let's just break some of that down. On your first points, there were 5 points there. Rock solid return on investment plan, business plan. Secondly, be able to drive through change quickly in an organized way. Third and fourthly was all around training and retaining the right people. And then lastly, culture. On the kind of business plan and return on investment, where we've seen people struggle, what in particular is it has meant that the business plan has fallen down and they haven't got that return on investment? Is it because they've taken too much of a short-term view? Is it because they haven't built into their ways of operating, foreseeing shocks and risks? What would you say it is?
I think it's a bit of that. I think it's clearly understanding the value back to the business in terms of tangible and intangible. John mentioned modernizing legacy applications, for example. In order to see that return on investment, you need a longer view. You need to be thinking 2, 3, 5, 7 years out. In order to do that, you have to invest now. And it's finding, it's none of our bank balances were as large as they were before. So being able to kind of cut the checks and invest now when cash flow is a challenge, I think for any organizations, even if it hasn't been, if it's been an area of growth, and I think some organizations have grown, we're all trying to be fiscally responsible. So it's understanding how much we spend now and how quickly we can see that as a return and what value that return is. Where that's clear, where that's understood, and where that's been easy to understand from a board, from a leadership perspective, those decisions have been made and those projects have moved forward. Where it's not, I think it's stalled and been pushed right.
And on the driving through change quickly, and in an organized way. What's the key there? Because if I just think of some of the organizations that have struggled, who haven't got the systems in place, there's going to be a tendency to panic, and then you also probably don't have the technology up to spec to be able to adapt quickly. Do you just need to accept in that situation that you're just not going to be able to service? Obviously we at Advanced very much, it's a B2B context we're dealing with, but do you just have to accept in terms of our customers that maybe you're just not going to be able to service customers, your consumer on the consumer side as quickly as you would like to, and it's better to just take the time and get the right system than rush, panic and get it all wrong and then lose those customers in any event?
It's a great question. I think, and by the way, I think it would be easy maybe for it to talk about highly structured ITIL ways of working and waterfall ways of working, and the answer is agile, for example. Actually, I think it's much more about priorities. It's about being able to organize yourselves well, being able to clear the decks for the people that you're asking to do this. Very few of us have spare resources that we can suddenly drop. Take, for example, Teams adoption, suddenly dropping that on somebody's desk and saying, we need to push this through in a matter of weeks, as opposed to months. It's about being able to understand the opportunity cost, to be able to know what you're sacrificing to achieve that and be okay with that. And then I think it's just about being far more coordinated and having that top-down message saying, why are we doing it? Why is it important? Why does it need to take hours and days, not weeks and months? And to not lose sight of that goal. Whereas longer projects, sometimes it can become very introverted and very focused on the process, but not necessarily the outcome.
What about, I'll come to John very shortly, but one thing you didn't mention, which just on a basic level occurs to me, is foresight and planning. So, I mean, I'm sure there are probably some people who are involved with some of our public sector agencies on this webinar. In the headlines over the last 2 to 3 days have been the issues with testing. Now, I got a family member tested over the summer, not a problem at all. We're in West London. We went to the Twickenham testing point, in and out 10 minutes, got the result within 24 hours. Actually, it was incredibly efficient. And so I was rather surprised to see over the last few days the reports about just how difficult it is to get a test now. But then I thought, surely it was obvious that when you started getting people, encouraging people to go back to the office, and inevitable when you had children going back to school, that you were going to have more people needing more tests, and therefore you're going to have to increase capacity. How on earth did they not foresee this from happening? And I'm not making like a party political point. I'm just, it's a practical logistical point. How did you not forecast this?
Look, it's a great. Again, it's a great question. I'm trying not to get party political in that respect. I go back to my team.
It's just I think what it is for me is a practical logistical issue, and whether I don't know just whether in the times that we're living in, you also have to have some kind of function in your business, or particularly if you're public sector and you potentially have huge volumes of people suddenly needing to use a resource, of kind of thinking about behavior change in different scenarios as this pandemic continues, that we're going to be going through this probably at least until the early spring, according to the scientists, with the vaccine. And being able to just think through different scenarios and how it's going to play, it seems to me is something that we probably all need to be doing.
Yeah, and it's needed to drive very rapid company culture change. So for some examples, that might be not only a user having Teams, but choosing to turn their camera on. I still know many organizations where people refuse to turn their cameras on, talking face to face. It's just part of the culture, and sometimes that needs to change. But likewise, if we take, for example, a project or program management function, understanding the project that's just landed on their desk, has to run at a step change that's completely different to everything else that they've run, and has to strike a balance between cost, speed, and quality. And I think if you can do that well, and if you have a function that can navigate that complex kind of triangle of needs, I think you do well. I think those that fall back into their old habits and lose sight of why it's different probably do get bogged down and either walk themselves into a cul-de-sac, or the project doesn't move forward at all. John,
on this issue of priorities, how have you seen COVID change people's priorities?
Hi, Chucker. Yeah. Well, I think it's made more people get in touch with us, really, and it's really made them focus on the legacy, on their technical debt and the legacy environments that they've got. You know, in the past, as I said, it was quite easy to do nothing. You know, that was everybody's preferred option. You know, doing something was risky. You know, typically these projects where you modernise large applications are not easy. They're very complex, and lots of things happen. There's lots of challenges along the way and stuff. So the easy thing for people to do was to just not bother. But obviously now doing nothing's become less attractive, let's say, because doing nothing leaves you exactly where you are. And sooner or later, that's probably in some problems. I mean, there's several options of how companies can move forwards, actually. I was just going to maybe talk a little bit about that. There's kind of 5 different things that people think about when modernising legacy. So the first one is retiring applications. So you think, oh, the application's not used anymore, easy, let's just retire it. Well, that sounds easy, but actually in most complex environments, it's pretty difficult. You know, it can be hard to unpick the application from a spider's web of connected other applications, you know. And, you know, people have had trouble where they, you know, switch one application off and then all these other applications, they didn't even know had anything to do with it, start failing all over the place, you know. So, you know, that can be challenging. And also the data in these applications can still be relevant. You know, even if the application is not used anymore, the data in it might be needed for all kinds of different purposes, you know, legal or any other reason. So, you know, companies like us can help people with that. You know, we can help people get that data out of the application into a sort of more modern, cheaper place to be able to query it and look at it. We've done a number of projects like that with government departments and Welsh Water, actually. So that's one kind of thing that people do. You know, if applications have reached the end of their life, then it's a good idea to try and retire them if you can. But as I said, it's easier said than done. A second option is replace. So quite often, if the application that you've got provides sort of standard functionality, then there might be like a commercial off-the-shelf software solution that you could replace it with. And that's, you know, that can be quite effective for people. So always there's a bit of manual re-engineering, manual effort with these replacement projects, because there's always a bit of customization or tailoring that needs to take place to meet your business's exact requirements. But similarly, you know, the data from the old application still needs to get to the new application. So there's stuff that, you know, we could do to help people on projects like that. The third is a kind of a re-engineering application. So that's really where your current application is not very good. So it doesn't do what you want it to. It's not great. You know, perhaps it's a good idea to start from scratch, or maybe take the best bits of your current application and move forwards. They're huge projects. You know, most of the applications that are out there that run big organizations have been around for many, many years. They've got hundreds of thousands of man hours invested in the functionality and the way they work and everything. You know, to sort of throw all that stuff in the bin and start again is pretty challenging for most organizations. I mean, we can do some stuff there to help. We've got some tools that can help find the business rules in existing applications, which might be a good starting point for writing a new application or whatever. And obviously it's just the same, the data needs to be moved across. And then we've got 2 final options. One is rehost. So I suppose that's taking your application and moving house with it. So moving your application, it's still using the same underlying programming technologies and maybe database and stuff, but moving it to a new, more modern platform. So that's quite a good option if the application's maybe got quite a short shelf life. So it's doing what you want, but maybe you're going to replace it in a few years' time, or you're going to do something else with it. So that might buy you some time, if you like, to enable you to think about what you're going to do for the future. I mean, what we've done at DWP is a bit of a mixture of that and the next one. You know, we're still using the same code, but we've got different database technology and a completely different platform. And then the final one is refactor your application. So that's really taking what you've got and transforming it into something, into completely different technologies. So taking your COBOL and turning it into Java, for example, which sounds like magic. You know, it sounds like a magical thing. How do we do this? Well, we've got tools that do it, you know. So, and lots of other companies have too. It's not just Advanced. There's loads of people who've got tools that work in different ways to perform these kind of transformations. You know, the proof of the future, you know, it future-proofs your application really. So as people go forwards, you know, the application will, you know, be ready for them in the future. So we've just had a project in Sweden, actually, with the student loans organisation, part of the government in Sweden, that's just gone live in May, and that's gone very well. So in summary, I'd say, you know, doing something has become a priority now.
Very good.
All of those options are valid, you know, for different within the same company, you know, within the same organisation.
Thank you so much, John. I wanted to come back to Yanis, but we're going to be transferred to the whole area, the big plenary area, in 20 seconds. So that just leaves me enough time to say thanks to everybody who has joined this session, and in particular to our panelists, Yanis, Matthew, and John, for, you know, providing some really interesting insight.